Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in us the fire of your love. Well, last month when Ashley was home, we have one of those like Weber fire pit things, and so we had a fire in the backyard. It was a cool evening, and we're sitting around and reminiscing about all the times we had been camping. And we were looking up at the sky, and it was just one of those clear nights where you could really see the stars. And so I started watching to see if I could find a shooting star. You know, I mean, it's such a fluke thing when you can. And we were talking about that. And at that moment, Mike and Ashley looked up at the same time, and all three of us, this star went. And it wasn't it was one of those where you don't, you know, and it's so rare that everyone sees it at the same time, but we all saw it. It was like, wow. And I think it's in the night sky when I'm like with the psalmist or with the Hebrews who said, you know, what is man or what are mere mortals that God is mindful of them? I mean, we're such a little speck in the cosmos. You know, you look at the sky and think of all the galaxies that have yet even to be discovered. And here we are, Earth. You know, I love in Eucharistic prayer, see where it says, this fragile Earth, you know, our island home. I mean, we're just this little tiny speck in the cosmos. But it seems like we're pretty big down here. I mean, there's a lot going on in this world. Some I wish wasn't going on in this world. We've come through a particularly couple grueling weeks of ugliness and contention and battle over a Supreme Court justice position. We're still battling over the immigrant situation and these kids who have been separated from their parents. I mean, you just turn on the news and you see all this contention that really began back in the garden. You know, here God is having, you know, in Genesis, the first reading this morning, he's got Adam naming all the animals. And then he creates a helpmate for her because he says it's not good for man to be alone. We're made for community. And yet, we don't know how to get along half the time. You know, Adam and Eve's first children, you know, one brother killed the other brother. Contention has been part of our story from the beginning of time. And yet we're called into community. We're called to love one another. We don't have to think alike to have a like purpose, to meet at this table, to share in the Lord's Supper, to bring food, to help people that don't have as much as we have. Our common purpose is to spread God's love in the world. Whatever side of the political fence or spectrum we fall on, it doesn't matter. We are part of God's creation. And I was reading one of the commentaries I get in my email, and this came from Paul Rode, a pastor at Augustine University in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And he talks about the gospel promise unites God's intention for creation and the steady transforming imprint of Jesus' serving, blessing, and calling together. From Genesis, we learn that God intends for us to live in harmony, peace, and love. From Jesus, we learn God's faithfulness in gathering us as children. How do we picture the scene? As these quiet, compliant, are these quiet, compliant, beautifully groomed children in clean, perfectly pressed garments? Or are they real children, active, inquisitive, rambunctious, and skin knees and runny noses and protests about who is getting the biggest cookie? It does not help us to be idealistic or romantic about our children or ourselves. Life is messy and unfair. Self-righteousness is neither helpful nor true. Jesus helps keep alive the imagination that Genesis began. God will call God's creation together again and again and again. The theologian Krister Standel said as he awoke each morning to wonder where God is mending the world today. Where do you see God mending the world? How does God call you to serve this mending? And I'll tell you, that's the thing, you know, as I was contemplating the readings this week, it's such an interesting mix of readings where you've got the creation story and the psalm reminding us of just the grandeur of God and that we're a part of this whole thing that God spun into being. And then we get to the gospel, and once again the Pharisees are trying to trip Jesus up and get him to say something that's going to get him in trouble with the other Pharisees because they're asking him about divorce. And of course, that's a contentious topic. It took the church like almost 100 years of Lambeth councils and, debate and consternation about what to do with people that were divorced. Could they get remarried? You know, here Jesus says if you get remarried after you're divorced, you're committing adultery. You know, like then there's no hope. If your first marriage doesn't work out, you're just stuck in misery for the rest of your life or stuck alone. You know, and so the church spent 100 years grappling with this before they decided, no, maybe it's okay to give people a second chance. Like if divorce is a sin, is it any less forgivable than any other sin? You know, and some marriages aren't made in heaven. You know, if somebody's in an abusive relationship, maybe it's better that they don't stay. I'm not condoning divorce. I don't think it's ever God's best. But things happen in relationships that you can't always foresee. You know, whenever young people are getting ready to get married, I always tell them marriage is the most wonderful and the most awful thing you will ever experience. Yes, and those of you who are marrying are laughing because you know this to be true. And when it's really good, it's really wonderful. It's so nice to go through life with somebody that gets it with you. But when there's times of contention, there are days where you think, why did I ever do this? A hermitage sounds good. But no, God meant us and designed us to be for each other. You know, and if not even just a spouse, just as in humanity. How is it that we come together as human beings and help this planet along? You know, as that author, that pastor wrote, you know, like, what's our part in mending and healing this world? You know, maybe one thing we do well is feed people. But there's all kinds of trouble in this world. And this past couple weeks, watching all the contention, it just made me realize how deep our divide is in this country. And it saddens me because we're all God's beloved children. You know, whatever we think about various things, we are each one beloved and we can't disown each other. We're interdependent. You know, I would be sunk if everybody was like me. I wouldn't have food to eat. I wouldn't have clothes to wear. I wouldn't have a vehicle to drive. I mean, I'm too out there, you know, to be useful sometimes. We're very interdependent on the works of those of others. And so we can't just go and wash our hands of the people that think differently than us. We need each other, whether we like it or not. God set this world in motion in a way that we were going to be dependent on Him and each other. It's just the way it is. And as I was trying to decide if I wanted to preach on the psalm, because I just love that psalm. You know, I get walking at night with the dogs, and I look at the stars, and this psalm rings through my head. What are human beings that you are mindful of us? That God knows us and knows how many hairs are on our head. He knows all the stars in the universe, and He knows each one of us so intimately. And I get out and see that night sky, and it just reminds me of the vastness of God's love. And so I was all ready to preach the psalm, but I thought, you know, this gospel is challenging because people can be all legalistic about stuff and miss the point. And so what does Jesus do? He says, let the little children come to me. And He says, if you do not receive the kingdom of God as a little child, you won't enter it. Kind of makes you stop short. Well, what does that mean? How do we keep our hearts and minds open? I think we forget that sometimes. When we're mad about somebody else's position on something, we forget that they're God's crowning glory. What if we looked at one another that way? What if we saw the blessedness in each other? What if we looked for the God spark that fills each of our lives, that keeps our heart beating and keeps us breathing and keeps us on this planet? What if we looked at the people who differ with us the most and saw that very thing that we have in common with them, the love of God? That we too are children of God, as are they, whether they know it or not. And there's a lot of people on this planet that don't claim to be Christian and don't even know they belong to God. But I don't think it makes them belong to God any less, whether they claim it or not. They're still God's beloved. So I come back to that, thinking of the vastness of all this and what a little tiny speck we are, and yet, as a little tiny speck, God has things for us to do. You know, we could just say, oh, what's the use? My mom used to say, I don't know how, with all the billions of people in the world God could pay any attention to me, I'd be like, Mom, He's God. You're putting human limitations on God. You know, we couldn't keep track of billions of people, but God can and does. And He's created us each uniquely that we might love the world in our own way with the gifts that we have and what we bring to the table. So what is it that you have to offer that can make this world a little better place? So I'll tell you, I'm tired. I'm just weary of all the contention. So I got to look at myself and say, what am I doing to help this? Am I doing anything to spread God's love and light a little farther? Or am I just adding to the contention? Am I adding to the controversy and flaming the fans? You know, I've got one of my friends from a former parish is always accusing me of stirring the pot when I post controversial things on Facebook. He's always telling me I'm stirring the pot again, and that's what liberals always do. Yeah, maybe I do, I don't know. I like to make people think. And if you leave here with anything today, I want you to think about what's your part in all this. You are maybe a speck in the cosmos, but you're a speck that was designed by God with intent and purpose, and you're gifted and beautiful and wonderful because God made you that way. And that's what each one of us brings to the table. So what do we do with our gifts? We can bring them to the altar, some of our gifts, and offer them back to help others. And really all of our gifts we can bring to the altar in a metaphorical way and offer them up for the world. There was, I think it was Irma Bombeck who had said before she died that she hoped to race into heaven just spent. And when she came before God that she could just say, I got nothing left. I used everything you gave me. Amen.